Hello, my name is Tanya. Welcome to another video tutorial for Say What, the English Intermediate. Today we're going to talk about the present tense. Now, the present tense consists of the present simple, the present continuous or progressive as it's also known, the present perfect simple, and the present perfect continuous. For the purpose of today's lesson, we're going to look at the present simple and the present continuous. So, the present simple, we will start with the form and the use. Now, this is perhaps one of the easiest tenses to form because it simply involves altering the third person pronoun. In this case, we have he, she, and it. In this case, with the verb, we add s. So, for example, if we're using first person pronoun with the verb work, I would say I work. Now with a third person pronoun like he or she, we would say he works or she works. In the interrogative, making a question, we might use the question form where. In this case, we have to add an auxiliary, do or does. This with the verb in the original form without the s. So the full question might be, where do you work? Perhaps using you as the example in the second person pronoun. Where do you work? Where does she work? Perhaps using a third person pronoun. In the negative, we would also use the auxiliary do or does, depending on the personal pronoun. But this case, being a negative, we would have to use not. So for example, I do not or I don't, in the contracted form, I don't work. Or in the third person, he does not or he doesn't work, again in the contracted form. In the written form, there are some rules to observe. Again, we know with third person singular pronouns like he, she, and it, we add an s. So in the example of the verb that we looked at, which was work, we add an s to make it works. Okay, now we have verbs which end in ch, sh, s, or x. In this case, we can't simply just add an s, we have to add an e, then an s. For an example, we have the verb watch, which ends in a ch, a c, and a h. In this case, we have to add an e and an s, so watch becomes watches. Similarly, in the verb finish, which ends in a sh sound, we have to add the es, so this becomes finishes. And we have other examples with verbs that end in s and x, where we simply add es. Then we have verbs which end in y. In these instances, we have to remove the y and replace it with an I. And then the full ending becomes an I in place of the y plus the e and the s. So a full ending would be ies. As in the example with the verb study, which ends in y, study becomes studies. Okay, and then we have a look at irregular verbs, which we're probably familiar with. We have the verbs do and go. Now, do and go, we add an es, they become does and goes. And then the very useful verb that we have, which is also irregular, which is have. Now, this becomes has. Okay, so now let's look at the use. We use the present simple to talk about permanent states or situations. An example of this may be I live or I work in London. These are both verbs in the present simple to talk about present states. We may also use the present simple to state facts or things that are generally true. An example of this would be the earth revolves around the sun. Now this is a fact. We would also use it to talk about things that happen if they happen on a regular or occasional basis. We are giving information about when they occur. An example of this would be they get up at 8 o'clock every day. We are talking about when things happen if they happen regularly. We may also use the present simple to talk about habits or routines and how often these things happen. An example is we play football every Saturday. Finally, we use the present simple to talk about the plots of books and films. An example, talking about the beginning of a story, we might say, the story begins in a land far away, or the year is 1950, for example. Okay, so now we move on to the present continuous, or again the present progressive as it's also known. We will start with the form and then we will look at the use. Now, the form for this tense, we have to use the verb to be. Now, as we know, the verb to be is also irregular. It has a form as am, is, or are, depending on the personal pronoun. In this case, to form a positive, we must use the am, is, are form of the verb to be, plus the verb, then the ending ing. An example of this, using an example of a third person like he, we might say he is working in London, or I am working in London, or you are working in London, depending on whether we use am, is, or are. Now, in the interrogative, asking a question, again we would use the verb form of to be, am, is, and are, plus the verb and ing. For example, are you working in London? Here we are asking the question, but we are changing the word order around. Now in the negative, again the same formula applies, am, is, and are, but in this instance we are adding not to show that it is negative. So I'm not working in London. Okay, here we have an example of first person I, plus am, not being the negative form, plus the verb working with the ing. Again, we have similar rules in the written form of the verb formation in the present continuous. As we know, we normally add ing to the end of most verbs. Example was work turns into working, and we similarly have read, which turns into reading. We also have some verbs that end in e. In these instances, we must remove the e and add ing. An example of this would be the verb dance. Now we have to remove the e and add the ending ing, dancing, without the e. Then we come to verbs which end in one vowel and one consonant. So in these instances, we have to double the last letter, which is the consonant, and then add on the ending ing. An example of this would be the verb swim. Here we have to repeat the last letter, which is m, then add the ending ing, and also in the way it is said, swimming. Another example would be the verb shop. Shop ends in one vowel and one consonant. So we would repeat the last consonant, a p, then add on the ending ing, so shop, shopping. Okay, so let's look at the use. We use the present continuous to talk about the present moment. An example, I'm wearing a pair of old jeans. We also use the present continuous to suggest an action is temporary, using words like now, at the moment, or at present. So for example, somebody rings to speak to their friend, and the mum or dad might say, I'm sorry, they're having dinner at the moment. We also use the present continuous for an action that is normally taking place around the time of speaking, which has perhaps begun but not finished. An example of this would be, I'm working a lot these days, so I won't have much time to see you. Now this is an activity which has already started, hasn't finished, but it is still temporary. Then we would use the present continuous for changing or developing situations. Now these are activities or situations which aren't fixed. An example of this is the Earth's temperature is rising. This is an action which is developing, which is increasing in this case. We would also use the present continuous with words like always and continually if we want to criticise or perhaps make a complaint. Now this is probably something you've heard before. An example, you're always talking on the phone. There's emphasis there on the always. You're always talking on the phone in a critical or in making a complaint. Then we would use the present continuous when something unexpected happens, perhaps more often than it should, perhaps on a frequent basis. Again, with the word always. An example of this would be, I'm always losing my house keys or forgetting where I put them. Here we have two examples of the present continuous. I'm always losing and I'm always forgetting. Okay, so there you have a brief description of the present tense with the simple present and the present continuous. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.